This is episode 549 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Robert Bryce. He is an author, journalist, and public speaker, predominantly on energy issues. Robert, I remember you were in New Mexico, might be close to 10 years ago now, but welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Glad to be with you, Paul. Love New Mexico. Spent a lot of time in New Mexico. In fact, I was just there back in August. So very soft spot in my heart for New Mexico.
Yeah, and you're based out of Austin, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And folks can find out more about Robert's work at robertbryce.com. That's your main website. Do you have any other places you'd like to send people if they're interested in finding out more about your work?
Sure. Well, I write almost exclusively on Substack now. So robertbryce.substack.com is where you can find more about me. I've written for a whole bunch of outlets during my career, but I really like the freedom that I have on Substack. I can write what I want, when I want, how I want, with the graphics I want, which I'm increasingly using in my writing to illustrate key points, including things like EV ownership and so on. So yes, robertbryce.substack.com. Thank you.
And you've written a number of books, and
six of them, not bragging here, Paul, but six. Yes. Count them. That's it. Right. And the latest is A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. So, it's out now, 3 years.
And I know that I have my copy of Power Hungry, The Myth of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. That's the one you were coming out to New Mexico to share with us and talk about at that time. So not sure, what year did that book come out?
Power Hungry came out in 2010, so 13 years ago.
Well, there you go. Maybe more than a decade it was since you came out and spoke to the Rio Grande Foundation. Yeah. So anyway, let's start off with just a kind of philosophical approach. I always like to understand where people are coming from. What is it that caused you to kind of take up energy as a critical issue in your writing and journalism, and how kind of did you form your views on the topic? I know that's a big question, but it's important to get those philosophical approach items out of the way.
Sure, no problem. Well, I grew up around the energy business. Tulsa's my hometown, right? So for, about 20 minutes, it was known as the oil capital of the world. My dad was not in the energy business. He was in the insurance industry. But he knew a lot of people in the oil and gas business. And so I knew people in that business, since I was a child, and was always fascinated by it. And then as I started working in journalism as a reporter, I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole career. The more I realized every other industry depended on the energy and power sectors. And so 30 some years ago, I started writing about energy and power, and then just continued down that path. And here I am now 30 years later, 6 books later, a documentary, podcast. I consider myself incredibly lucky to be able to cover the energy sector and the power sectors, because as I said, every other industry depends on them. And they are also the biggest industries in the world. Global electricity sales are $5 trillion a year. And they're also incredibly contentious. And so I look at these industries as much as I can through a very much of a numbers focused approach. I don't consider it to be ideological. Of course it is ideological, but I'm not a partisan, and I don't care for partisan politics. I don't root for either team, but I root for the consumer. I root for the ratepayer. Those are the people, and the blue collar people. Those are my people. I love those people, and I hope to speak up for them.
Yeah, but it is the so-called green movement that dominates the political kind of the news cycle. It seems to dominate the fundraising, at least for the Democratic Party, which happens to be ascendant in Washington. Of course, New Mexico, which has the unique position of being a energy state and also being a pretty darn blue state. Why is this such an issue now? Utilities used to be just kind of boring and steady income for investors, not a lot of new things coming out of that industry, but now it really is all energy all the time, underpinning so many different aspects of our political debates
Sure. Well, it has become very much a partisan issue, and that's really unfortunate because, as I said, it's not, there are no Democratic or Republican electrons or Democratic or Republican molecules, hydrocarbon molecules. But what is very clear to me, and this is the part where, and I'm going to say, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm disgusted. I am disgusted. But what I see with the Democratic Party increasingly is this disregard for the effect that a lot of these climate related policies are having on the poor and the working class. And this is a particularly big issue for New Mexico, which is not a wealthy state. Your per capita income, of memory serve, per household incomes less than $50,000. So, these policies that are around climate, I understand the motivation, but the Democratic Party for years has presented itself as the party of the working class. And it's just not true anymore. And it's one of the reasons for the rise of Trump, I think, is that Trump understood this and understood the concerns of the working class. And increasingly the Democratic Party doesn't. And so their headlong rush to enact climate policies, I think are, they're just by and large, they're just regressive, all of them.
Yeah, and it is highly frustrating as a resident of one of the most dependent states when it comes to energy, and kind of a state that has street cred, if you will, if there is such a thing, street cred in terms of energy, going back to all very, very distant times of the past, relative to American history, and the kind of importance of energy across those different silos. It's frustrating to see our political classes in New Mexico be so ignorant of the realities of industry, of energy needs, and where that realistically can come from.
Well, and also just to interject one quick point, and I've written recently about the Permian Basin because obviously Exxon's merger now, or takeover of Pioneer Natural Resources, which is an enormous merger, enormous deal, $64 billion. But it points to the importance of the Permian Basin. And part of that, of course, is in New Mexico, to overall energy security in America. And the surge in production of oil and gas from the Permian has been a great benefit for the state of New Mexico, in part because of obviously the royalties paid to the state, but also federal royalties, the workforce, labor, manufacturing, all of those industries that are around the Permian Basin have been a great thing for the state of New Mexico. And people forget it. I mean, they don't know about it or they forget about it. But this domestic energy production that has happened largely in the wake of the shale, has been turbocharged by the shale revolution, has been incredibly beneficial to consumers across the country because due to lower energy prices, but also particularly beneficial for states like Texas and New Mexico, which are home to the Permian.
Yeah, well, we could talk a lot about the Permian Basin, and that is an important issue, and maybe we'll get back around to it. But right now, the most pressing energy issue facing New Mexico is our governor's headlong push to mandate electric vehicles in the state of New Mexico, essentially following the broad parameters of what California has done. We have regulations before the Environmental Improvement Board, a unelected governor-appointed board, to mandate 43% of vehicles sold in New Mexico by 2027 be electric. By 2032, that number goes to 82%. Not quite the complete phase out California is doing, but let's just talk about the causes of this. What do you really think is driving policymakers, especially Democrats, to take such a hard stance? And it's happening in the White House, Biden administration as well. Why are they coming after the gas powered vehicle, the internal combustion engine?
I think the first answer I think is climate change, right? That they see the EV as this symbol of an easy way to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, it's not easy and it's incredibly expensive, but there's some kind of, I've thought about this a lot, Paul, in terms of where we are in terms of in the environmental movement in America, environmentalism. And as I see it, environmentalism and traditional environmental thought, traditional environmental belief, or, for the Sierra Club, Audubon, you name it, And I say this as an avid bird watcher, an avid nature lover, hiker, that this environmental ethic has been replaced by climatism and renewable energy fetishism. And the EV fetishism is part of this, that it's the idea of this vehicle as a get out of jail free card, that we can drive as much as we want as long as we use this, incredibly metal intensive vehicle. We can drive as much as we want. It's kind of like a get out of jail free card, right? We can cure climate change with this electric vehicle. It's just not true. And it's particularly pernicious for a state like New Mexico, which has a high poverty rate, has a relatively low household income relative to other states. EVs are being sold to the Benz and Beamer crowd. This is not a working class vehicle. So the fact that I was frankly surprised to hear that the state was considering such a draconian regulation, because it screws the poor and the middle class. I mean, just screws them. And it doesn't even necessarily screw them in terms of the availability of the vehicle, but it's also the cost of the upgrades to the grid that are going to be required to charge all of those electric vehicles that are being driven by rich people.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the environmental aspect of electric vehicles, because obviously at the tailpipe, EVs do not emit CO2 or any other pollutants, but there's also more to the story with EVs, and it does seem like the overall environmental benefits. I mean, it depends on what your goals and aims are. Obviously, CO2 is kind of the cause celeb of the day, but there are other environmental issues. And then, there's the efficiency aspect of what tools should and could be used to reduce CO2 emissions, if that's a goal, as opposed to other options that might be more affordable and more effective at actually achieving the environmentalist goals. So tackle those in any order you feel is appropriate.
Well, let me just return to the grid for just a minute, Paul, because I think this is the key the part that is not being discussed to the extent that it should. So let's just assume, let's agree, okay, EVs are a good way to try and reduce CO2 emissions and therefore address climate change, right? Let's just accept that as a path, a policy way forward. How are we going to afford to upgrade the grid in Santa Fe, in Hobbs, in Farmington, in Albuquerque, in Las Cruces, in you name it, across the state, Artesia, across the state of New Mexico? Who's going to pay to upgrade the grid that would be able to meet this massive new demand for electricity? And remember, it's going to be high amperage demand. In other words, it's going to require a lot of flow of electrons. Well, how do you do that? Well, that means you have to upgrade the substations. You have to upgrade the local transformers. Who's going to pay for that? It's going to be socialized. The ratepayers are going to have to pay for all of these upgrades to the grid. And that is a regressive energy tax, a full stop. It just is. So not only are the vehicles themselves going to be more expensive, but the infrastructure that is going to be required to fuel them is going to be incredibly expensive. And a friend of mine, Jacob Williams, pointed this out the other day. We're going to deploy all these transformers, all these transmission lines, all this other stuff, so to meet a load that is only very small in terms of the hours per day. So the load factor on those transformers, et cetera, will be very low. So it's just an incredibly expensive way to try and address climate change, but it has just captured this imagination of policymakers that this is some way we can do this that's cheap and easy. It's incredibly expensive, and it won't be easy at all. So I didn't address exactly the questions that you put there, but I think it's important to think about the network and the systems that are involved here, and why we've evolved to use gasoline. Gasoline, you can love it, hate it. It's a miracle substance. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. And that's why we use it. And the same with diesel fuel. Electric cars have been around for 140 years, and they still are only single-digit percentages of overall car sales in America.
Well, one of the aspects of the grid, and I do agree that's obviously a huge issue, is that we're already in the process of reworking our grid here in New Mexico. Again, the current governor in 2019 pushed through the Energy Transition Act, which has us on a pathway, theoretically, to eliminate traditional fossil fuels from New Mexico's electricity portfolio. We shut down the San Juan generating coal-fired power plant, and PNM, the Public Service Company of New Mexico, the largest utility, has already expressed concerns about the stability of the grid moving forward. So there's that, but they didn't embrace any of what I would consider to be the logical tools for replacing coal. No liquid or not liquid natural gas, but no natural gas combined cycle plants. Nuclear also not viable under the Energy Transition Act. And then you're on top of that talking about EV charging stations and increasing the demand, which I've seen 20 to 50% as the amount that electricity demand would increase. So
right.
Where do you see states like New Mexico and California going with regard to the grid and that component of the transition to electric vehicles?
Well, I'm glad you brought up California, because Paul, remember the California, it was only a day or two before had the California Air Resources Board had issued a rule that eliminating the sale or prohibiting the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles in the state by, what was it, 2034, 2035, something like that. Remember, this was not passed by the assembly. This was not passed through the legislature in California. It was implemented by the administrative state. And this is one of the key things that I think is absolutely imperative that people remember when talking about all of these regulations that are being promulgated for this so-called energy transition. By and large, they are not being passed by state legislatures. They are instead being passed by the administrative state. And this was clearly the case in California, and it appears to be what's up in New Mexico as well. But look at California. So the Air Resources Board announces, oh, we're going to prohibit the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. And then 2 days later, there was a power shortage, and the government in California was saying, hey, don't charge your EVs because we don't have enough juice. I mean, it was like, you couldn't make up the timing if you tried. But it's the bigger picture here is the grid that we have today is faltering under existing loads. And we've heard warnings from numerous, regional transmission operators, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, from the commissioners at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all on the same page saying we are facing a reliability crisis on the grid in America. And yet at the same time that this is happening, that these policymakers and regulators are saying we're in danger of losing reliability of our grid, the policymakers are saying, oh, well, we'll just add a whole new slug of new demand onto the grid. It's as though they don't read their own press releases. I mean, this is happening at the state and the federal levels, where they're promulgating a lot of policy that is blind to the fundamental nature of the networks that we're talking about here. It's dangerous policy, Paul, and it worries me greatly.
Yeah. So, California's had its share of outages, blackouts, brownouts. Texas, of course, has as well. And, the environmentalists love to, trash the Texas electrical grid because, of course, Texas is a red state, but they've certainly gone down the same path as California in a lot of ways. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but yeah, it just, it seems like there's only one way that we're going to learn our lesson here, and that is for some number of states to be facing these blackouts and brownouts, and for it really to cause some problems. But obviously it hasn't deterred California. It doesn't seem to have deterred Texas.
No, and first, remember that this is also happening at the federal level too. So you have the EPA in April issued a proposed rule that would require automakers 2/3 of the vehicles they make to be EVs. This was in April. Almost exactly a month later, in May, the same agency issued a proposed rule that would hamstring the hydrocarbon fueled power plants across the country. Could affect 90% of all the electricity generators in the country and force them to reduce their CO2 emissions dramatically. So, I mean, we're facing this enormous wave of regulatory regulations coming from the federal government and from the state governments that are internally contradictory. I mean, I look at this and I speak a lot. I do a lot of public speaking across the country, and I'm looking at the EPA in particular, thinking or asking the question, are they even reading their own press releases? Do they even understand that their own regulations are contradicting themselves? So again, I think this is a lack of ability of the regulators at the local and federal and state levels to understand, think at a systems level, which I think is the critical way to consider all of this.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Ford is losing lots of money with electric vehicles that they produce. I've heard car dealers are not selling large numbers of EVs. As states like New Mexico and California, to name just two, push this policy forward, they're obviously in contradiction with the consumers of their states. I know it's a little bit of hypothesizing and game theorying, but where do you see this whole thing going? Are the voters going to finally hold the politicians accountable in some of these states? Are they going to just kind of circumvent the law? Maybe some combination of the two. Where do you see this whole thing moving?
Well, I think, well, let's just take the EV slice for just a minute. One of the things that I have reported on Ford, and Ford in the second quarter lost something like $73,000 for every electric vehicle it sold. I'll wager that those losses will actually increase to around $80,000 per EV in the third quarter. Ford is going to report their financials at the end of this month. But I think what we're already seeing in the electric vehicle space, and the Wall Street Journal has been reporting on this, is that sales are declining. They're not rising in the way that they were, that consumers are looking across the board and they're thinking, you know, the Benz and Beamer crowd, the likely EV buyers, a lot of them have already bought their EV. And so the sales are cooling off. So I think some of this on the consumer side may be the thing that slows some of this progress, right? That policymakers can say, well, we're going to mandate EVs, but they can't necessarily mandate that automobile buyers buy them. So, you know, like California, they ban internal combustion engines and internal combustion engine vehicles. Boy, I'd like to be an auto dealer in Reno, you know, or Phoenix, right? Because consumers are going to vote with their wallets and their feet. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to see. But
But won't they just go to regulating the registration of those vehicles down? That's the next logical step, right? Just you can't register non. Okay.
And that could well be, but I think that, you know, there if you look at what's happening in Europe, so let's look at where the locus is here and where are the trendsetters. Well, it's obviously Europe has set the trend for California. California is following Europe. Well, what is happening all across Europe? The backlash, I mean, against all of these electric vehicle mandates, against carbon restrictions, net zero. Look at Rishi Sunak, the prime minister in Britain, just a few weeks ago, rolled back, said, oh, we're going to cool off. We're not going to push these net zero policies. We're going to be more realistic, pragmatic. Those were the words he used. In the week after that, he made that announcement, after, you know, backpedaling on these climate policies, the Tories' ranking in the polls went up 4 percentage points. So voters across Europe, same thing is happening in Germany, same thing is happening in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France, the Yellow Vest movement. Politicians are listening to the voters, and the voters are saying, we don't want this stuff. This is not for us. This is for the elites. This is for, and so the politicians are seeing this. So if California is following Europe, and it is, then I think eventually the chickens are going to come home to roost. Now, when will that be? I don't know, Paul, but I think that it should be a part of the referendum on the Biden administration in 2024, if it's going to be Biden, if in fact he doesn't retire before then or something else happens. But you know, I'm not looking forward to Trump versus Biden, but energy policy should be on the table.
Yeah, well, obviously, a lot of this does depend on the electorate, and unfortunately, New Mexicans have a long track record of just pulling the lever for the party that seems to be hell bent on implementing a lot of these policies. But where kind of backtracking a little bit,
Sure.
It seems to me a little bit odd, and maybe average New Mexicans, that such a profound policy decision as going kind of whole hog on EVs doesn't have to go through the legislature, can go through this unelected body. Talk about that little quirk, if you will, in American politics, or at least I know California has that. You mentioned it, the California Air Resources Board, but New Mexico, it's the Environmental Improvement Board that can do this. Why are states able to do this?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons why you see this this effort that is, why is it happening at it with the administrative state? Well, it's easier, I think, for the politicians to say, "Oh, well, the administrative state did this. It wasn't us," right? So that saves them from that hard vote on natural gas bans, for instance, right? So, or something like that. Congress isn't implementing these kinds of restrictions. Instead, it's being done by the Department of Energy or the EPA. And so you have this greenhouse gas rule, for instance, from the EPA on power plants coming just a few months after an important Supreme Court decision, West Virginia versus EPA, in which the High Court said, you cannot, the EPA, you are not allowed to just go ahead and make any rule that you want. We need clear legislative intent. So I think this is one way for politicians to use the administrative state to push through rules that create political risk and then require litigation, years-long litigation, to try and roll them back. But they are able to get policies implemented in a kind of a backdoor way through the administrative state in ways that they know they would never be able to achieve were they to try and go through the legislative process.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, and it would be probably DOA in the legislature, even here in New Mexico, which is controlled by Democrats. Now, I'm going to put you in the position of kind of king or some high power position.
Careful, Paul.
Yeah, I know.
You
It's
might
risky.
not like it. I will be
But,
benevolent, but only to a certain degree. I would, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
but let's talk about, if you're working to both keep or bring economic prosperity and
Sure.
balance that with the environment, and a genuine effort to not only reduce CO2 emissions, but also to be kind of careful about other forms of pollution that seem to be ignored in these conversations. How would you approach these issues? It doesn't have to be one specific solution, but do you think United States should go nuclear, like kind of a crash course in nuclear power? Do you think we should transition through combined cycle natural gas plants? Where would you take this conversation? Electricity generation, vehicles, et cetera. How should we be doing this?
Sure. Well, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. I've been pro-nuclear for more than a dozen years. I've been saying the same thing very consistently now for 13 years. So you mentioned Power Hungry, my fourth book earlier. Natural gas to nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonization, then let's get serious about natural gas and nuclear. Now, the U.S. is incredibly fortunate. We're blessed with just staggering quantities of natural gas. And in fact, we talked about the Permian earlier. The natural gas production out of the Permian Basin has gone up something like fourfold just in the last decade or so. So now producing on the order of 24 billion cubic feet per day, and almost all of it associated gas. That is gas that's coming out of the ground mixed with oil. So this is just an incredible example of the geology of the Permian and how prolific it is that we're seeing this massive increase in natural gas. But then let's talk about nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonization, serious about reducing CO2 emissions, then we have to be serious about nuclear energy, full stop. And the top climate scientists in the world have said this. So has the International Energy Agency. This is obvious. You cannot make massive strides in in decarbonization with renewables. You just cannot do it. And the reasons are many. The first being that they're intermittent, and the second being they require too much land. And then we can go into supply chains and metals, minerals, et cetera. So the great attribute of nuclear is that it has very small footprints and low material inputs and super high power density. And all those things go together. This is what the iron law of power density. The lower the power density, the higher the resource intensity. The obverse is true as well. The higher the power density, the lower the resource intensity. So natural gas and nuclear share that same high power density and low material intensity. So if I were king, if I was the president, what would I be doing? And this is one of the things that I just cannot understand. Where President Biden talks about climate change, he will never, not once in his presidency, as he mentioned the word nuclear energy, not once. Why not?
Except he locked up that plot of land over in Arizona when he came through New Mexico that had some of the best uranium reserves in the entire world available there.
Right. So, but if the parties in charge in this right now, it's the Democrats, if they're serious about climate change, well, then get serious about nuclear. But unfortunately, the president is refusing to use the bully pulpit to push this forward. Now, are there a lot of obstacles? And let me be clear, Paul, I'm very sober when I think about and talk about nuclear. There's nothing about this that is going to be cheap or easy or quick. But if we're going to play the long game, that's the long game we should be playing. And New Mexico is rich in uranium, rich in a lot of different mining. I used to live there. I lived in Window Rock for a couple of years. I've seen mining in New Mexico. We have the mining capability in the United States, but we're going to have to dig this stuff out of the ground. But unfortunately, the other problem that we haven't talked about in terms of EVs and much of this alt energy stuff is that it depends on foreign supply chains, and in particular, China.
Yeah. Well, but I'll let you jump into that in a second, but
Sure.
Let's specifically talk about transportation. Is the most logical approach to transportation to stick with the gasoline powered car and trucks and diesel trucks? Should we make an interim transition to natural gas in some of these cases, hydrogen, or should we do the electrification thing, but using nuclear and other forms of clean or cleaner power? Where would that logically go if in
Sure.
Robert Bryce land?
Sure. Well, hybridization is the obvious way forward in terms of increasing efficiency and therefore lowering emissions. And Toyota Motor Company, which is a very sophisticated outfit, right? They never have embraced this full EV business, and they're coming along and they're producing more EVs. But Toyota has long said, in fact, they have gone to the federal government and said, if we're serious about reducing the mineral and metal intensity of our auto fleet, then hybrids are the way to go, because they are just more efficient in terms of metals and minerals than fully electric vehicles. So that is one of the obvious ways forward, is continuing the growth in hybrid vehicles. And interestingly, Paul, that's what consumers are doing. When you look at the sales recently, particularly at Ford, we talked about Ford earlier, their sales of hybrids are far outstripping their growth of the sales in electric vehicles. And why is that? Well, consumers are comparing the two and saying, well, I get better mileage with the hybrid and I don't have to depend solely on electric charging. So it gets me some benefit, but of electrification, but not full electrification. So here's my punchline. Gasoline and diesel fuel are miracle substances. They will be with us for decades to come. How do we reduce emissions from the transportation sector? Hybrids are part of that. Some of it will be electrified, fully electrified, but that will be a very slow process. And we have to understand that process will be slow, but we're not going to get refined oil products out of the transportation sector anytime soon, not in my lifetime, and I don't think in my children's lifetimes.
Yeah, I'm looking at a tweet from the LA Times that's attached to an article. Many environmental groups hate plug-in hybrid technology. Plug-in hybrids will only delay California's ambitious transition to an all-electric fleet, they say. So anyway, obviously, some of the most powerful special interest groups in the country are opposed to the hybrid movement, though.
Well, and let me talk, if I could, just for a minute, Paul, because I know the Rio Grande Foundation, you operate on a fairly slim budget. Let's be clear about where the money is here. And I'm working on a piece for my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. And I've written about this before, on the staggering quantities of money, the volumes of money that are flowing into these climate NGOs and climate related philanthropy. It's staggering, the numbers. I mean, truly, truly staggering by my calculations, and I can back it up. The anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear NGOs in America, such as Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, a new group called Rewiring America, another new group called the Climate Imperative Foundation, have combined annual budgets exceeding $4 billion. They are outspending the traditional hydrocarbon groups. You hear about, American Petroleum Institute and the big oil companies and their associations. They're being outspent 4-1, at least 4-1. So the overwhelming majority of the money, the media attention, and the momentum is on the anti-hydrocarbon side, what I call the anti-industry industry. They are incredibly well funded, and including a new grant that just came in September from Michael Bloomberg of $500 million. I mean, these are just enormous numbers.
Yeah. Now, we have to wrap it up in just a few minutes, but
Sure.
I do want you to talk about the supply chains, UAW striking right now. A lot of people assume or believe that is ultimately partially driven by the transition and potential shift of the supply chain overseas, including to China. Talk about that briefly.
Sure. Well, and it's also not just the shift of the supply chains and the manufacturing to China, it is also to Mexico. Ford is building all of these Mustang vehicles that they're the electric vehicle, the what do they call it? The Mustang, the whatever it is. Those are built in Mexico, not in the United States. The UAW is striking in part because of their concern about the electric vehicle business putting them out of work, and they are right to be concerned. But the bigger issue, I think, and I'm not minimizing the labor issue, nor the importance of the UAW and their strike and where that might end up. But when you look at the EV supply chain, in particular, let's drill down to neodymium iron boron magnets. These are the high strength, what are called high coercivity magnets that are the key ingredient in nearly every electric vehicle that's sold in the world. 90% of those neodymium iron boron magnets come from China globally. In the US, we get over 80% of our neodymium iron boron magnets are now sourced from China. Why, Paul, in the name of Peter, Paul, and Mary, would the United States cede its critical supply chain for a critical infrastructure, for a critical industry to the Chinese, and do it now? I mean, from a tactical, geostrategic standpoint, it makes no sense whatsoever. But it's not just the magnets, it's copper refining, metals refining, rare earth elements, all of these things. We're just forgetting that we've made ourselves almost completely dependent on Chinese supply chains. It's a very dangerous situation in terms of our international security, and it's not just about automobiles; it's about defense as well.
All right. Well, any final points you want to make? Thank you very much for your time today, Robert. Tons of great information, but all good things do have to come to an end, unfortunately, and I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Paul. Always happy to reconnect, and always happy to talk about these issues. This is my purpose and my passion. So pleasure to be on robertbryce.substack.com.
All right. Perfect. That's what I was looking for. All right.
Go.
Thank you, Robert. And we will talk to you later. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.